Hello and welcome everyone to my Lightning Golem Ascendant guide. This build features permanent ranged minions that have been around forever, but have never quite made it into the minion meta because of the underwhelming damage of the base minion. However, in 3.21, the Lightning Golem has been buffed indirectly because the mechanics of returning projectiles were reworked and are now finally usable across the board. To introduce the return mechanic to the projectiles of the Lightning Golem, we have to link them to anomalous faster projectiles, as well as Pierce, which limits the build in terms of gems to some degree, but overall represents a large increase in damage. In general, I would say that the build outperformed my expectations, although there are some limitations regarding the dynamic or actual in-game DPS. The Lightning Golems sometimes use one of the other abilities, which doesn't happen too often, but is still noteworthy. And the fact that the lightning projectiles have to first pierce the boss and then return means that it takes a second or so before equilibrium DPS is reached. The reason we want to play Lightning Golems on the Ascendant is because minion builds featuring golems that deal elemental damage hit the sweet spot of the Elementalist Ascendancy. It grants +1 maximum number of summoned golems and an additional -20% resistances when inflicting exposure. Whereas on the Necromancer, we would have to decide whether we want to get +1 to maximum number of summoned golems or to enhance exposure via Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh. The other ascendancies are the Necromancer for minion damage and offering effect, and either Deadeye for maximum DPS or Guardian for improved defenses. Despite my best efforts, I could not make a viable low-budget version of this build because we need a lot of different pieces to come together, and the resulting build would simply be outperformed by other minion builds at that price point. One of those builds is the Absolution Ascendant, which is what I personally recommend as both low budget and leveling for this build. I won't go over all of the details of the leveling process, but I did leave an Atlas passive tree progression and a general skill guide for the campaign, because most of you probably never leveled an Absolution Ascendant before. The low budget gear features basic rares with life, resistances, and attributes, as well as a couple of inexpensive uniques. For example, the Convoking Wand is simply rolled with a deafening essence of fear for the minion damage. For the shield, you want to go with Jaresso's Courage for elemental resistances and to get pseudo block capped. Skullhead further increases elemental resistances, gives minions 25% chance to block attack and spell damage, as well as a 10% life recovery on block. If you combine that with Bone Offering and Anoint Decay Ward on your amulet, your minions will be incredibly resilient towards hit-based damage. Grip of the Council gives useful stats to the player, as well as 40% cold resistance to minions and 20% of physical damage as extra cold damage for minions, at the cost of 10% reduced movement speed, which is acceptable. For the jewelry, you want one open suffix if possible, so you can craft the elemental resistances, minion elemental resistances double modifier. In general, minion elemental resistances are harder to cap on the Ascendant because we don't have access to Commander of Darkness like the Necromancer does. To further increase damage, I recommend a couple of Ghastly Eye Jewels with a flat physical and lightning damage. For the flasks, you want to get yourself a Life Flask that removes bleeding, Rumi's Concoction for armor and block, a Quicksilver Flask for movement speed, a Quartz Flask with increased armor for phasing, and an Amethyst Flask for chaos resistance and reduced shock effect if possible. The Spectres of choice are the Carnage and Host Chieftain for Frenzy and power charges on minions, and the Arena Master for the damage buff. The Baronite Cleric is not a good option because the damage aura has a tiny radius and will thus rarely ever affect your Sentinels of Absolution. The AG gets a couple of inexpensive uniques, for example Relentless Fury for Culling Strike, Leercast for minion damage, the Blood Dance for life regen, a pair of Hunter-influenced gloves with chance to unnerve enemies on hit, if you can find affordable ones, otherwise skip them. Zendethis' Cassock to Chaos Cap your Guardian, and to allow it to create Consecrated Ground on block, which is powerful in itself, but is made even better by the Broken Faith, which transforms that Consecrated Ground into Profane Ground. In case you don't know, Profane Ground gives 1% flat critical strike chance and minus 10% to all resistances against affected enemies. The medium budget is where the Lightning Golems really start to shine, because we can now afford all the necessary pieces to boost their damage, while also scaling our defenses to comfortable levels. For bossing, you want Pierce and anomalous faster projectiles, so that the lightning projectiles of the golems can pierce, return, and then hit the boss again. Whereas for mapping, greater multiple projectiles is optimal for clear speed. As you might have noticed, this build has a pure energy shield base, and while this is strictly speaking not necessary, I still like to do it for a couple of reasons. First of all, we get a lot of intelligence from passive points, which scales energy shield without actually having to invest anything. It also allows us to use Skin of the Loyal to boost our defenses, in addition to scaling minion damage via plus levels. And last but not least, we can use CI, which makes us immune against chaos damage, in turn alleviating modifier pressure on the gear because we don't have to get chaos resistance. Combining chaos inoculation with divine shield and this armor and energy shield mastery allows us to mitigate the impact of chaos and physical damage, which leaves only elemental damage. To deal with that, we're using Graven's Secret, which transforms the power charges we get from the Host Chieftain into absorption charges. These charges give you 12% of elemental damage taken from hits, is recouped as energy shield, meaning you recoup almost half of the elemental damage at maximum absorption charges. The rest of the gear are mostly rares with energy shield, resistances, and attributes. Noteworthy mentions include Aegis Aurora for defenses and energy shield recovery on block, the Convoking Wand, which you can craft by rolling a Convoking Wand eye level 76 to 82 with a Fractured Minion damage mod, utilizing Bound, Corroded, Metallic, and Shuddering fossils in the same resonator. A Rubus Circlet with a Fractured +2 Minion levels modifier that is rolled with Deafening Essences of Loathing and Eldritch Currency for the explicit and implicit mana reservation efficiency modifiers. While those are pricey, especially later in the league, they are important to fit all of the auras that we're using and can later be recycled for the higher budget versions of the build. You also need 3 Primordial Jewels and the Anima Stone for your golems, as well as Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flash to allocate the Elementalist Ascendancy. Flasks are similar to the low budget version, with the Life and Amethyst Flask being replaced by a Bismuth and a Silver Flask for more resistances and speed while mapping. Last but not least, there are the Cluster Jewels, We want a large cluster jewel with 12 passives that have increased passive effect, minion attack and cast speed, and flat ES to boost damage and defenses, as well as a medium cluster with renewal and feasting fiends for lively drawn minions. The additional spectre you should now have access to can either be a Primal Rex Matriarch or a Pale Seraphim for the debuff. The AG now uses a cold attuned buckler, so it can inflict brittle on block, Crown of the Tyrant with a blue socket for added lightning damage and minus resistances, Legacy of Fury for Scorch, which lowers the enemy's resistances even further, Gravebind, so enemies killed count as being killed by the Guardian, and last but not least, a Crusader influenced chest with an explosion modifier to increase clear speed while mapping. The high budget version utilizes well-rolled rares, for example this Convoking Wand with the double crit suffixes and fully crafted Crucible mods, a proper minion shield, the Hubris Circlet you saw earlier, but this time with properly rolled explicits, implicits, and a proper lab enchant. In addition to that, you want to get jewelry with flat and percentage-based energy shield, and I made a video about crafting items like those on the minion shield, and I've left the link to my crafting guide playlist in the description below. Another noteworthy mention is the Ashes of the Stars with a decent amount of reservation efficiency and max quality to boost gem effect. The flasks are pretty similar to the medium budget. You want to replace the Bismuth flask with Bottled Faith for regen and damage, and use an Elemental Resistance flask for bossing that you adjust to the main damage type of the encounter, so Sapphire for Shaper, Elder, Maven, and Cortex, Topaz for Uber Eater, and Ruby for Uber Exarch and Cyrus. The cluster setup includes 2 large minion clusters with 12 passives that have increased effect, minion attack and cast speed, flat energy shield, and either a resistance or an attribute modifier. A medium minion cluster with renewal and feasting fiends, and a small cluster with mana reservation efficiency with increased effect, flat ES, attributes, and or resistances. And we need the mana reservation efficiency from the cluster and the other gear, so we don't have to invest as many passive points in order to get to Charisma like we did in the medium budget version. The AG now uses a Kingmaker for Fortification, increased crit multi, and Culling Strike instead of the previous weapon and shield combination, and an influenced chest with both the Crusader explosion modifier and the Hunter regen mod for increased survivability of the AG. Which brings me to the ultra high budget version of the build. This version works differently from the medium and high budget version. Instead of using a regular Convoking Wand and a decent shield while socketing the Lightning Golems in the body armor, it utilizes a 7-link Convoking Wand and the Squire while socketing the Lightning Golems in the wand to access the additional support gems. I made a detailed step-by-step guide on how to craft caster-based 7-link weapons like this one. You can find it in the crafting guide playlist as well. For the Crucible mods, we want levels, minion crit, socketed skills are supported by Pierce, and either Volley for clear speed or Elemental Army for maximum DPS. I didn't end up crafting the 4th modifier on my wand because I accidentally corrupted it and I was tired of wasting my currency, so I just called quits after the 3rd mod. Since you no longer need the plus levels from the Skin of the Loyal, there are several options for the body armor. For example, a Grasping Mail with fractured increased global defenses, a rare chest with can apply an additional curse to save passive points, or +1 maximum number of spectres, like mine. The reason I went with the +1 maximum number of spectres is mostly because I initially tried out a setup with offensive spectres and lightning golems in the convoking wand, but this setup proved to be suboptimal and I didn't want to craft another chest, to be honest. This version is overall much better in terms of damage, due to the higher base damage, especially if you actually craft a 4th Crucible mod, and because the projectiles also have a 93% chance to return, because the Squire gives anomalous faster projectiles an additional 8% quality. In addition to that, it also utilizes Val Haste, which can increase DPS while active, at least for certain encounters. The downsides are decreased utility minion survivability, because of the missing generic plus levels from the gear, and lower maximum elemental resistances on minions because we have to use the Squire instead of a proper minion shield. The lower level of the Spectre gem also costs you +1 maximum Spectre, unless you're using a chest with the specific Delve mod, as I mentioned before. That's pretty much it for the build. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments below. I try to get to them as soon as possible. I also wanted to announce that I've set up a Discord server where people can ask questions about my content, discuss the mini meta, and of course Path of Exile in general, as well as a Patreon page for those of you who want to support my work. The link to the Discord server and the Patreon are available in the description and on my channel page. This was my last build for the league, but it will cover relevant Path of Exile 2 news, ExileCon, and of course the next league once we know more about it. Hope you enjoy the build, don't corrupt your wand, and see you in the next one.